Hi there. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm absolutely delighted to spend the next 20 minutes talking about digital trust infrastructure. The Cardano Foundation approached the BRI about doing a research project about what is the infrastructure that's going to underpin the next economy. Road systems, rail, ports, electrical grids, the internet. These are all foundational infrastructure upon which we have built economies. We've built entire societies. And infrastructure is what happens when a group of technologies mature and get formalized and get standardized and coalesced and abstracted into something that other people in an economy and in a society can build value at very accelerated paces. They reduce the friction of collaborating, of communicating, of transacting. And the question is, what in fact will be the new infrastructure? Infrastructures define ages. The roads and rail systems and even the port systems help define the industrial age. The internet and telecommunication infrastructures and electrification, amongst others, help define the information age. And the economy that we will build on top of the next infrastructure will be a very new kind of economy. And so the task that the Cardano Foundation set for us was to do a piece of research to explore what that infrastructure looked like, to look at the component pieces, analyze how they're being coalesced, investigate examples of proto-emergence of infrastructure projects, both in government and in industry from around the world. The basis of any infrastructure really has to do with trust, and this is especially true in the new infrastructure. Trust has to do with reliability. It has to do with predictability. It is fundamental to the goal of infrastructure of reducing transactional friction. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that the basis of this next infrastructure is a trust layer. The digital trust infrastructure model that we've built really is based on these 5 discrete layers of technology. The first layer of the infrastructure is the foundation. It's the trusted data fabric. It's what happens when you take a group of data sources that can come from any number of different places, and it will be a hybrid trusted data fabric, but you underpin it with a truth anchor. And this is where distributed ledgers and blockchain come into play. There certainly are going to be certain kinds of data that will be stored on the chain, but more often than not, the chain will be used as a means of creating truth anchors for data that resides in a great variety of different locations, hosted by a great different number of types of organizations and governments. There are various different abilities that we can start building on top of this infrastructure. They include an identity layer. And at the identity layer, we have to think of identity in a number of different component pieces. There's a core identity, and the core identity is the essence of who we are. And as we represent ourselves to other people, it is the identifier that allows us to define ourselves as an individual. Then there are also an extended group of structural definitions about identity. And these are our certifications, our licenses, or academic credentials. They are something that is structural about who we are. They're the transactions upon which our credit ratings are based. And then above that layer, there is a slightly softer but a social reputational layer to our identities. And this explains our trustworthiness, it explains our experiences, it explains how people think of us, and it also incorporates things like our social media. And then on top of that, we have an operational layer. And this is really an emergent layer that becomes more and more important as we move further and further into the AI era. We think of it as an identic layer. Identic really being what happens when agent technology evolves to a point where it has some degrees of real agency and objective creation and represents us in transactions. These agents bank for us. They advocate in the healthcare system on our behalf. They transact with other companies, with other people, and with other agents on our behalf. And we need to represent an identity for this operational layer so that as our agent interacts with other people or agents or companies or governments, that certain things about that agent are understood. Who owns them? How they were trained? What are their capabilities and certifications? So these incorporate what identity really is about. And identity isn't just about people. It's about the billions and billions of IoT devices out there. It's about our automated vehicles. It's about the various different sensors that capture carbon content in various different goods around the world. It tracks various different goods in transit across supply chains. They also represent company entities or governmental entities, organizational entities that also want to represent to the outside world who they are and what their capabilities are and their certification and their trustworthiness. And finally, as we've already kind of alluded to, they also now are going to be representing AI-based agents, whether they are agents that represent us as people or agents that represent companies or agents that have a particular capability and have a particular function in an ecosystem. And so identity applies to all of these things. The next layer in the trust infrastructure is all about authoritative registries and data exchanges. And this is what allows infrastructure to really work. It's the rules and standardization that allows different components of infrastructure to interact with each other. There are going to be not only trust registries having to do with the identity layer, but authoritative registries that have authoritative information about a particular domain, and data exchanges that allow information to flow freely back and forth between these different systems. We're already seeing various different proto-examples in private industry, in the healthcare space, things like the X-Road initiative in Estonia and Finland and being adopted by various different governments around the world. There's many of these emergent data exchange capabilities out there, but they provide the security and the basis for data to move between the various different pieces of the trusted data fabric. The next layer is programmable value and digital payments. These are the payment rails. This is how we move value with very, very little transactional friction between different entities in any sort of ecosystem. And of course, this space has been maturing and developing over the last 15 years and has seen a tremendous amount of innovation applied to it. And as we are now moving into this next era, we're seeing increasing sophistication around things like central bank digital currencies and especially around stable coins. And there are regulatory initiatives coming out of government in jurisdictions around the world, here in Europe, in North America, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, where the recognition of the power of turning currency into a digitized format so that we can move value around the world between different actors incredibly quickly and efficiently is very, very compelling. And so this layer is being formalized. It's also, by the way, a formal layer of something called Digital Public Infrastructure, DTI, which is a UN initiative and is being adopted by various different governments as a means of delivering public infrastructure to citizenry. And digital payment rails is part of that framework as well. But DTI, Digital Trust Infrastructure, is kind of a superset. It's a broader definition, much more comprehensive. The next layer, the top layer, is something that we call universal basic intelligence. AI plays two fundamental roles in DTI. It provides a backplane to enhance all the other layers, to provide risk analysis, to do discovery of cybersecurity threats, to provide predictional boundaries so that we can figure out when something is outside of a patterned norm. But more importantly, and more relevant to most of us as individuals or as businesses or as policymakers, is that it will be expressed as a service. And we're already seeing this manifest in various different companies where they've implemented a company-wide intelligence that allows their workers to interact with various different functions, whether they're inspecting a warehouse or they're moving into a marketing meeting. But it's an intelligence that is trained on a specific domain, that it has information relevant to that particular context and situation. And what we believe is going to happen is that jurisdictions are going to see an awful lot of value of investing in a basic intelligence that is trained on the jurisdictional information of local regulations and of local laws and local customs and duties and local culture and linguistic preferences, local banking norms. And small businesses will be able to query and find out how to very quickly and efficiently get access to the proper approvals and licensing, how to do compliance, how to find partners and customers, how to build marketing and sales campaigns that are relevant to the domestic audience in which they find themselves. And we're going to see many, many manifestations of this being implemented. And under the covers of this, there's all kinds of questions about how, in fact, do we train these things? The reality that it's not going to be a monolith, but it's going to be a federation of various different AI capabilities that will be manifested as this basic level of intelligence. So, DTI as a framework, the idea here is to provide a basis so that we can have intelligent conversations, that we can develop really important strategies about how to move forward and how to create value at an accelerated rate. It has some very core basic ideas. The most fundamental of them is the transition of architecture and attitude from one of capturing data, storing data, and then forwarding that information as part of a transaction to some sort of counterparty, often across some sort of messaging interface, to a new world where it's much more of a request and verify. And that sounds like perhaps a difficult transition to imagine, but it really is very fundamental. And the way that we build and architect systems will be different because of this change in mindset that is enabled by this new infrastructure. It's going to be a hybrid environment where we're going to have lots and lots of different types of data from various different sources, once again, glued together both through interoperability data exchange frameworks as well as through trust anchors. It's going to need to have very strong public-private partnerships. This has been true of the emergence of all kinds of different infrastructures throughout history. But especially now, we're going to have to figure out who is going to define the standards and the rules, which parties are going to bring innovation and capital and expertise to bring this potential into the real world. And that's going to be a very important focus, that we're going to need to figure that out. All of this is going to be accelerated by AI, as everything else is in the world these days. But AI becomes really a fundamental part of core infrastructure and available to everyone in this world. And governance, the flywheel, accountability, figuring out what the rules are. It's just like the road systems. If we didn't have the governance around it that everyone abided by driving on a particular side of the road and adhering to various different signage in certain kinds of ways and speed limits and the like, and that the cars weren't built with certain safety considerations and anticipated braking distances and acceleration capabilities and all those sorts of things, the system doesn't work. You need a lot of governance around these sorts of things for it to work. And once again, we're not inventing this out of whole cloth. We've been working on this technology for a very, very long time, and they're now all coalescing. And really, this comes down to this fundamental thing, that at the foundation of all of this infrastructure is this concept of trust. The lack of trust is such an inhibitor to efficient operations. the challenges that we have with fraudulent presentations of capabilities, that counterparties that may assert their ability to have signing rights on behalf of a company, and only to discover later that, in fact, that wasn't true, and we've entered into a series of very expensive transactions, and we've got to go and unwind them and deal with the financial implications. And then because of all of that, we've got to go and figure out who these people are ahead of time and investigate them and do background checks. All of this is terrible friction. If we can embed those things into the background, where people can assert a certain credential that I can do these things, a presentation where you don't need to know all the details. A truck comes across a border, and we know that the contents of that truck is certified, has been inspected, has a certain carbon content, is sourced ethically, complies to all the various different regulations, and that screen on the customs border crossing guard goes green and says, yep, you're done, through. That's taking vast, vast amounts of friction out of the system, accelerating, in this case, trade. So the benefits are substantial. Simply just in the reduction of fraud exposure and the reduction in compliance costs, because compliance in DTI becomes part of the fabric. It becomes so much easier to design for compliance because the system is inherently auditable. It's much easier for regulators and for tax authorities to actually monitor things and figure out what's going on. So because it's embedded in the fabric, it takes a lot of the cost out of the system. Lower transactional frictions are pretty obvious. Much faster onboarding, right? Because background checks, once again, all of that is now an inherent part of the underlying infrastructure in the network. Ecosystem automation becomes much more possible as all those frictional barriers start to reduce. The ability to build automated systems that span across ecosystems becomes a very real possibility. Understanding risk and being able to manage around that risk is something that also becomes quite accelerated in this world. Better decision making as well as accelerated ideation innovation. So these are the potential benefits. The call to action is that we're really on a precipice. We have a lot of stresses in our society. We also have to recognize that economic growth has traditionally been based on three fundamental pillars: ready access to inexpensive labor, ready access to plentiful and inexpensive capital, and factors of productivity. Well, because of the demographics in most industrial countries, we don't have the first one. We don't have that labor subsidy that previous generations have had access to. The vast majority of the capital that has subsidized most of the economy for the last 30 years came from the baby boomers' investments. That great source of capital, that great subsidy, isn't available to us to nearly the same extent. And that means that we have to focus on the factors of productivity to realize any sort of economic growth. And we need a new infrastructure upon which we're going to build that new kind of economy. So, about 5 months ago or so, the Cardano Foundation came to the BRI and said, we want to explore this topic. We want to bring together a whole bunch of bits and pieces and put them into a framework that can act as a real call to action, as a means to coalesce a lot of interesting ideas into something much more substantive. And so we've produced this report. It's being published today. It's a pretty extensive report. I'm incredibly grateful to the large number of Cardano Foundation colleagues that have contributed to this research, as well as to the many academics, policymakers, and business leaders from around the world who were interviewed and actively participated in this research. I hope that you will all find the research very interesting and benefit from it, and that it provides an intellectual framework to engage in those highly productive conversations. And so we really hope that we can help. We hope that this research is helping, And we're very grateful for the opportunity to share some of our ideas with you and look forward to collaborating with any and all of you going forward as we collectively engage on our journey towards the next economy. Thank you very much.